Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and today I'm going to introduce you to the dialogue Laches. We're actually continuing a theme that we ended with last week. Last week I did a video on the dialogue Protagoras, and it ended with the question of courage. What is courage? And a discussion about courage. We're going to continue that today because this dialogue is all about courage. But first off, to get into this dialogue, I think we need to meet the characters. There are quite a few of them, and some of these Greek names can be rather difficult. So it gets confusing quickly. So let's take a look at the characters. We're going to meet two men, Lysimachus and Melesius. And by the way, I'm going to apologize in advance for butchering some of the names that are going to come up here, because some of them are rather difficult for me. But these two men each have a son. Lysimachus has a son named Aristides, and Melesius has a son named Thucydides, I think. And they want to know, Lysimachus and Melesius want to know what studies their sons should undertake to grow in the best way. So they ask two military generals, and the generals are named Laches and Nicias. Now it seems that Lysimachus and Melesius have already been asking many people these sorts of questions because they've already gotten some ideas, and they were advised that they should have their sons learn sword fighting in armor. And so obviously two military generals would be good people to ask about it. This is something that Lysimachus explains for what they're looking for. And all of the translations, by the way, that I'm going to use today are from the translator Benjamin Jowett. Okay, he says that our care is to discover what studies or pursuits are likely to be most improving to them. And as for the question of fighting in armor, he says, we hope that you will give us your opinion about this art of fighting in armor, and about any other studies or pursuits which you would or would not recommend for a young man. Well, Nicias and Laches both welcome this discussion. Laches further recommends that they bring in one other person, Socrates, who just happens to be sitting nearby. And Laches says to Lysimachus about Socrates that he is of the same deme with you, and is always passing his time in places where the youth have any noble study or pursuit, such as you are inquiring after. A deme, by the way, is like the district or village within the city-state. Okay, so in addition to being from the same area, Laches also is pointing out here that Socrates regularly talks with young people, and he knows a lot about various studies or pursuits that young people are interested in. Here's another thing, though, that Laches says of Socrates. He was my companion in the retreat from Delium, and I can tell you that if others had only been like him, the honor of our country would have been upheld, and the great defeats would never have occurred. So we see here that Socrates was a soldier and was seen as a good soldier, a courageous soldier, and obviously that would be significant for this discussion. But there's another thing that I think is worth pointing out here, is that we're going to see in the course of this discussion that Laches and Socrates have a good relationship. There's a certain trust or bond that tends to develop among military veterans who had fought together. And we can see some hints of that, at least here. It's not really focused on, but we do see that there's none of that hostility that Socrates often gets from other interlocutors and other dialogues. Here there's none of that. There's just a certain camaraderie and trust and respect. Okay, well, going back to the conversation, Lysimachus wanted to know their opinions on the study of fighting in armor. And we're going to see that Laches and Nicias disagree. First, Nicias supports the study for young men of fighting in armor. He says that it's a noble skill. He also believes that it leads to other skills needed by a military general. And he also makes the case that it develops courage. Well, Laches takes a very different view, and his view can be summed up with this quote, that none of these masters of fence have ever been distinguished in war. All right, since the two men disagree, then Lysimachus will turn to Socrates. Socrates is seen as like the tiebreaker. He says, but as Laches has voted one way and Nicias another, I should like to hear with which of our two friends you agree. Well, you can probably guess that Socrates was not a big fan of majority rule. He argues that a good decision is always based on knowledge and never on numbers. So he proposes instead to find if either Nicias or Laches is an expert on teaching virtue, or if not, perhaps one of them can name a good teacher. He says, must we not first of all ask whether there is any one of us who is an expert in that about which we're deliberating? If there is, let us take his advice, though he be one only, and not mind the rest. If there is not, though, let us seek further counsel. Well, everyone agrees with this, and so now Socrates is going to begin his usual sort of questioning, and so the dialogue from this point is going to fall into that usual pattern where Socrates is questioning and someone else is answering. And he's going to start with Laches. He says, then, Laches, suppose that we first set about determining the nature of courage, and in the second place, proceed to inquire how the young men may attain this quality by the help of studies and pursuits. Okay, so from here we're going to get Laches' definitions of courage. And we're going to see two definitions, but let's start with this one. I'll come back to this page and show you a second definition. But first we'll start with this one. He is a man of courage who does not run away, but remains at his post and fights against the enemy. All right, well, Socrates is not entirely opposed to this definition, but it's not quite as broad as he wanted. He wanted something more general, not just courage in battle. He wants to know about those who not only are courageous against pain and fear, but mighty to contend against desires and pleasures. Well, if you've seen the video I did some weeks ago about the virtues, then you probably recognize this definition, or at least you can see that this is hinting towards the definition that was built up in that video. And in that video, I turned to the Republic for a definition. That's where Plato develops this definition very well, very detailed. That's one of the middle dialogues, the Republic. And I point this out because there is a common idea floating around that the early dialogues, the one that I've been covering these past few weeks, these are all early dialogues because supposedly Plato had not yet developed his ideas. However, when you read some of the middle and later dialogues, and you see how Plato is going to develop the virtues, for example, also like the theory of forms, the theory of recollection, and so on. When you read those dialogues and then go back to these early ones, you can see that he's already hinting at the insights in these dialogues that he's going to develop later. And that means that he must have already had it all worked out. Now, I do talk about this in a little more detail in a video I did on the dialogues. I did an overview of the dialogues, and then in the second half of that video, I talked about why the early dialogues are early and how to read them in a way that gives you the most benefit out of them, and actually how to read not only the early dialogues, but also the middle and late ones as well. So if you have not seen that video, I do encourage you to watch it, and I will link it here. All right, well, Laches is going to now give a second definition for courage. So this was the first one that we'd already seen. Now we're going to add one more. I should say that courage is a sort of endurance of the soul. Well, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to modify this just a little by adding the word wise. It must be wise endurance, and this will become significant later. But now they're going to realize that even with this modification, there's still a problem. Wise in what? Sometimes the person without knowledge is actually the braver one. And here's an example. So you would say then that he who in an engagement of cavalry endures, having a knowledge of horsemanship, is not so courageous as he who endures, having no such knowledge. Okay, so in other words, if you find yourself thrown into a situation that you had not planned for and you're not knowledgeable, to stay and endure anyway, that takes great courage. And so sometimes the person without knowledge is the one who is actually more courageous. But then there's also, they have to contrast that with the person who kind of throws themselves into a bad situation without having knowledge. And so there's a foolish way to be unknowledgeable, and therefore it's not courageous. And so they say, and yet men who thus run risks and endure are foolish, Laches, in comparison with those who do the same things, having the skill to do them. So they have this contrast. And so then they're going to point, Socrates points out here that whereas courage was acknowledged to be a noble quality, and Laches says that's true. And now on the contrary, we're saying that the foolish endurance, which was before held in dishonor, is that courage? Laches says, so we are saying that. Are we right in saying so? And Laches says, indeed, Socrates, I am sure that we are not right. All right, so Laches is not able to develop then a successful definition for courage. However, what we see is that he does demonstrate a respect for Socrates, and he never gets salty with him, never gets an attitude or angry with him. His pride never flares. He has an all-around positive attitude, I would say, towards continuing the inquiry. He says, I am ready to go on, Socrates, and yet I am unused to investigations of this sort. But the spirit of controversy has been aroused in me by what has been said, and I am really grieved at being thus unable to express my meaning. So the question has grabbed him, but he's not able to come up with a good answer yet. At this point in the dialogue, he ends up taking a back seat, and Nicias is going to come forward and take a shot at defining courage. Here's Nicias's definition of courage. He says, courage is the knowledge of that which inspires fear or confidence in war or in anything. So Socrates first wants to clarify this definition, that courage is the knowledge of the grounds of hope and fear. And Nicias agrees that yes, it is. Well, Socrates points out that by this definition, no animal can be called courageous. He says, he who takes your view of courage must affirm that a lion is not naturally more disposed to courage than a stag, nor a bull than a monkey. Now, I'm going to point out here, though, that later on when Plato develops his definition of courage in the Republic, for example, the same critique is open to him as well. And I think that Nicias' response to this is a good one. He says that there is a difference, to my way of thinking, between fearlessness and courage. I am of the opinion that thoughtful courage is a quality possessed by very few, but that rashness and boldness and fearlessness, which has no forethought, are very common qualities possessed by many men, many women, many children, many animals. All right, so Nicias, in other words, is separating the courage that you see in a lion, for example, from what we might call fortitude, which does require rational thought. And in all fairness to Nicias, Plato is going to ultimately make that same distinction, although not in this dialogue. Okay, in this dialogue, Socrates is going to kind of change gears. He's not really going to focus on this since it's not obviously something that he feels strongly about. He's going to instead point out that Nicias' definition comes from a sophist named Prodicus. We briefly saw Prodicus in last week's dialogue, the Protagoras. Prodicus is one of the other sophists who was staying at the same house as Protagoras was. He had just a small part in that dialogue. But anyway, here Socrates says that Nicias got all of this from their friend Damon. And Damon is always with Prodicus, who of all the sophists is considered to be the best at analyzing the meaning of words of this sort. I wonder if the bugs outside are recording. So I apologize if you can hear the sounds of nature from my window. Okay, well, Socrates wants to question Nicias further. He drops his objection concerning the animals at this point. He's going to go in a different direction, and they're going to find that this definition of Nicias actually has some bigger problems. He says, in our opinion, the terrible and the hopeful are the things which do and do not create fear. And fear is not of the present nor of the past, but is of the future and expected evil. Okay, so the problem with this definition is that it focuses only on the future. However, when you're looking at a body of knowledge, it should cover the past, the present, and the future. And to give an example, he uses medicine. He says there's one science, and the word science in Platonic literature is often used to imply or to mean a body of knowledge. So they use the word science in a much broader way than we use it today. Okay, so there's one science or body of knowledge of medicine which is concerned with the superintendence of health equally in all times, present, past, and future. Then the courage must be a science which is concerned not only with the fearful and hopeful, for their future only. Courage, like the other sciences, is concerned not only with good and evil of the future, but of the present and past, and of any time. Once Nicias agrees, Socrates can reach this conclusion. And according to your view, that is according to your present view, because Nicias has now agreed with what was said up to this point, courage is not only the knowledge of the hopeful and the fearful, but it seems to include nearly every good and evil without reference to time. So the person with complete knowledge of good and evil would then be wanting in no virtue. Therefore, courage would be not a part of virtue, but all of virtue. Well, this dialogue, like other early dialogues, ends without any answer being decided on. They never do find a definition, and so Socrates ends by saying, I maintain, my friends, that every one of us should seek out the best teacher whom he can find, first for ourselves who are greatly in need of one, and then for the youths, regardless of expense or anything. But I cannot advise that we remain as we are. And so this is where Plato ends it. It's for us to figure out for ourselves what courage really is. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the dialogue, Laches. So thank you very much for watching all the way through. If you have any questions at all or any comments you want to make, please leave them below and I will get back to you. And I hope you'll think about subscribing. I do put out a new video once a week. So next week we're going to move from talking about courage to talking about the virtue temperance, sophrosun. And that's a dialogue called Charmides. So I do hope you'll join me. Thank you very much.